Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be learning about control structures in Java. Now, before you learn about how you can implement control structures in a program, you need to understand what control structures actually are. In programming, control structures basically help you to control the flow of your program. In Java, there are three types of control structures. You can have if statements, if else statements, and if else if statements. The first thing we're going to take a look at is if statements. Now, if statements contain two important parts. It contains a condition and a block of code. An if statement is pretty simple. If a particular condition is true, it's going to execute a block of code. So in this case, if this condition is true, it's going to move on to and execute this block of code. However, if the condition was false, it will not execute this block of code. It just moves on to the rest of the program. Now we're going to implement the if statement in a simple Java program. Over here, you notice that I made a class called control structures, and I also created the main method. In our main method, we're basically going to implement our if statement. Now the syntax for the if statement is just simple English. First, you're going to add if, which is just a keyword that tells the program that we're going to have an if statement. Then you're going to have these brackets, after which you're going to add these parentheses. Before, we've seen that the main parts of an if statement are the condition and the block of code. We're going to add the block of code over here in the parentheses, and we're going to add the condition over here in the brackets. Now, a condition is anything that evaluates to true or false. So over here, if I make a boolean variable called boolean a and set this to true, this could also be a condition. I can just put a over here. In this case, this condition always evaluates to true because our variable a is set to true. So if I add a println statement over here that just prints the condition is true, basically whenever this variable a is true, it's going to print the statement. Since this variable a is set to true, it's going to be true and it's going to execute this statement. When I run this code, you notice that I do get that statement, the condition is true. Now I added another statement after this if statement that just prints control structures are easy. When I execute this, you notice that it prints both of the statements as it should. Since this condition is true, it's going to execute this statement and then it's going to move on to this statement after the if statement. Now, what if I set this to false instead? If it's false, it's not going to execute this block of code, but it is still going to execute this statement since this println statement is outside the if block. When I run this program, you notice that we only get the second statement. Control structures are easy. Now I did tell you that your condition is anything that evaluates to either true or false. So you don't always have to use just booleans. There are other things that you can use as well. For example, I added this statement or this expression 3 is lesser than 5 as our condition. Now we know that this should evaluate to true. When I run this program, you notice that it does print the statement in our if block. The condition is true. Now that we understood if statements, we're going to take a look at if else statements. Now if else statements are also really simple. They only consist of three main parts. You're going to have one condition as usual, but you're going to have two blocks of code now. Now your if else statement is first going to check your condition. If your condition is true, it's going to execute this block of code 1 and skip this block of code 2. It's not going to execute this second block of code. However, if this condition was false, it's going to execute this second block of code and skip this block of code 1 or just not execute this block of code 1. In other words, your block of code 2 just acts as a backup for whenever your condition is false. Now we're going to implement that if else construct in our program as well. The first thing you need is you need to check your condition. Now we're going to do this using our if statement as we've seen before. So we're just going to say if, and we're going to add these brackets and then these parentheses. Now if this if statement is false, we need to execute another block of code. And we're going to do this by using what's called an else statement. We're just going to say else and we'll just add these parentheses. Now obviously we don't need brackets for the else statement because we're not checking any more conditions. If something's true over here, we're going to execute this statement in our if block. However, if it's false, we'll just execute this other statement in our else block. It's simple English. Now we'll just take a condition and two blocks of code and understand exactly how this if-else statement works. Now we looked at a few simple examples for conditions till now. So now we're going to look at a little more difficult example. We're going to make a condition that involves inputs. As you can see, I imported a util package and then I made a scanner class object called SA. Then I basically asking the user to enter two numbers, and whatever the number the user is going to enter, I'm storing them in these two variables A and B. So let's say I want to find out which number is larger in these two numbers A and B. We're just going to say that if A is larger than B, we're going to print that A is larger than B. However, if A is not larger than B, it must mean that A is either equal to B or A is lesser than B. So we'll add a println statement to print that over here in our else statement. So we'll just say now the println A is lesser than or equal to B. As you can see, it's a pretty simple program. It just tells us what number in two numbers that the user is entering is greater. When I run this program, it's going to ask me to enter two numbers, and we're just going to enter the numbers 3 and 5. Before I click enter, we'll try to predict what the output is actually going to be. Over here, 3 is going to be stored in the variable A, and 5 is going to be stored in the variable B. It's going to check if this value 3 is greater than the value 5. That's obviously false, so it's not going to execute this piece of code. It's going to move on to the else statement, and it's going to execute this println statement, which just says A is lesser than or equal to B. When I click enter, it does print that A is lesser than or equal to B. So program works perfectly fine. Now something important that you need to understand is an else statement cannot exist without an if statement. And makes sense why. The else statement is only going to execute if the condition of an if statement is false. If there's no if statement, there's no condition to check for, and therefore an else statement is not necessary. So if I remove this if statement, you're going to notice that we're going to get an error. An if statement can exist without an else statement, but an else statement cannot exist without an if statement. Now I made a small change in my program. After my if statement and my else statement, outside this if else block, I added a println statement that just prints compared two numbers. Now something important that you need to understand is that all statements outside your if else block does not depend on this condition. So even if this condition was false, it's going to execute this else statement and then move on to whatever's after that else statement. However, if this condition was true, it's going to execute this if statement and then skip the else statement and move on to this println statement. To show this, I'm going to execute this program. Over here, it asks me to enter two numbers, and let's just enter the same number. So let's just say 3 and 3. Over here, our condition is clearly false, so we're going to execute this else statement and then move on to this println statement and print this println statement. When I click enter, you notice that we get two outputs. We get A is lesser than or equal to B, which is what we predicted, and we also got compared two numbers. The println statement that's printing compared to numbers does not depend on the condition. Now we're going to be learning about our if-else statements. Now our if-else statements are pretty simple. And as you can see, it consists of two conditions and three blocks of code. So what we're going to do is we're going to check our first condition. If our first condition is true, we're going to execute our first block of code. And we're going to ignore everything else. We're not going to execute the second condition and other blocks of code. We're just going to move on to the rest of the program. However, if this first condition was false, we're going to ignore the first block of code and move on to the second condition. Then we're going to check our second condition. If the second condition is true, we're going to execute the second block of code and we're going to ignore the third block of code. However, if our second condition was false, we're going to ignore our second block of code and move on to the final third block of code. Here, our first condition acts as our if statement, our second condition acts as what's called our else if statement, and our third block acts as our else statement. And now we're going to implement our if else if statement in a program. So the first thing we need is our if statement to check our first condition. So we're just going to say if, and we're going to add our brackets and our parentheses. Now if our first condition is false, we're not going to execute the block of code in our if statement, and we're going to move on to a second condition. To check a second condition, we need to add what's called an else if statement. So we're just going to add else, but we're going to add if after that. And again, we're going to add brackets and parentheses. This is completely different from an else statement. Over here, you're checking for a different condition. So you will need to add these brackets. Now, if this else if statement is also false, we're going to add another else statement as a final alternative. If our if statement was false and our else if statement was false, we're going to execute our else statement. Now, we're going to write a program that is going to input three numbers from a user and find out what's the largest number. So as you can see, I made a scanner class object called SA and I'm asking the user to enter three numbers. I'm storing the three numbers in three variables A, B and C, and now we just need to determine two proper conditions to find what's the largest number. Now I can think of two simple conditions for this particular construct. So our first condition is we're basically going to check if A is greater than both B and C. And our second condition, we're basically going to check if B is greater than both A and C. Now, if this is true, we're going to print that A is the largest value, because if A is greater than both B and C, it must be the largest value. Now, if this condition was false, we're going to move on to a second condition. Now, our second condition is going to check if B is greater than both A and C. If B is greater than both A and C, it must mean that B is the greatest value. So we'll just print that B is the largest value. Now, if both of these conditions are false, we're going to move on to the else statement. If A is not the greatest value and B is not the greatest value, then C must be the greatest value. So in an else statement, we're just going to print that C is the largest value. Now we'll just convert this simple English to the proper syntax and add the conditions. So first condition is checking if A is greater than both B and C. So to do this, we're just going to say A is greater than B and A is greater than C. So and over here is what we call a logical operator. When you have multiple conditions, you can join them using things like the AND operator or the OR operator. Now in this particular case, I want both the conditions to be true, so we're going to be using the AND operator. If you're not sure what the AND operator or the OR operator does, I recommend you watch the video on logical operators. So in this particular case, it's basically checking if A is greater than B and A is greater than C. If this is the case, we're just going to add a println statement that prints that A is the largest value. So now that we're done with this, we'll add our second condition. Now if our A is not the largest value, we're going to check if B is the largest value instead. If B is greater than A and if B is greater than C, it must mean that B is the largest value. So we just add the same println statement over here and we'll instead print that B is the largest value. Then we're going to move on to our else statement. If this condition is false and this condition is false, it must mean that C is the largest value. So we're just going to add that over here. We're going to print that C is our largest value. Now there's actually another change that we need to make over here. Over here you notice that I'm printing the name of the variable, but I'm not actually printing the value that's stored in the variable. So to fix this, we're going to add the variable and we're going to concatenate whatever value is stored in the variable with this string is the largest value. We're going to do this to the other two variables as well. We're going to add B plus is the largest value and C plus is the largest value. Now we're just going to run this program. So when I run this program, it's going to ask me to enter three numbers. We'll just enter the numbers 1, 3 and 7. This program should output that 7 is the largest value. When I click enter, you notice that it does give us that answer. It tells us that 7 is the largest value. Now we'll try to understand how nested if statements work in Java. Now nested if statements don't require anything new like we've seen with else statements or else if statements. Nested if statements are basically one if statement inside another if statement. Over here you notice that I have a condition 1 and a condition 2. Condition 1 is the condition of the first if statement, but condition 2 is the condition of a second if statement inside our first if statement. If condition 1 was false, we're going to ignore everything else. We're not going to execute our condition 2 or our block of code. However, if condition 1 was true, we're going to execute condition 2. If condition 2 was false, we're going to skip the block of code. However, if the condition 2 was true, we're going to execute the block of code. So both conditions, condition 1 and condition 2, have to be true for the block of code to be executed. Now we're going to implement a nested if statement in a real program. Like I told you before, a nested if statement is just one if statement inside another if statement. So we're going to make our first if statement over here, and we're going to add our second if statement inside this first if statement. This first if statement is going to check for a condition. If that condition is true, we're going to move on to a second if statement. If that condition of the second if statement is also true, only then are we going to execute the block of code inside the second if statement. Now, on the other hand, if the first condition was false, we're going to ignore the second condition and the block of code. Now, obviously, since it's a nested if statement, I can keep going. I can make another if statement inside the second if statement. So in this case, for something in the third if statement to be executed, the condition of the first if statement, the second if statement, and the third if statement should be validated to be true. Let's just remove this third if statement and add some particular condition. I'm going to make a variable called boolean b and set this to true. And I'm just going to use this variable b over here and over here. I'm basically making sure that both the conditions are currently true so that we can test our program really well. So we're going to add our println statement inside our second if statement, and we're just going to print that we are in the second if statement. When I run this program, you notice that it prints that we are in the second if statement because this condition and this condition are both true. Now, if I make this false by just adding a not operator before our p, then this will not execute. Then what happens is that since the condition of our outer if statement is still true, it is going to move on to this second if statement. But since the condition of the second if statement is false, it will not execute this println statement. Now we can add another println statement outside this second if statement to show that we do enter this first if statement. So we'll just say we are in the first if statement. When I run this program, you notice that we do get that we are in the first if statement, but we don't get this output because the condition over here is evaluated to be false. Now I try to explain the basics of control structures as well as I can, but you still need to practice quite a lot to make sure that you're good at using control structures in your programs. Thank you for watching and have a great day.